You're not just watching a video, you're witnessing history most people will never hear. Subscribe and stay till the end. A language with no living relatives. That's the official description linguists give it. A branch of the Indo-European family tree, standing entirely alone. No sister language anywhere on Earth. Politicians have built museum wings around that fact. Textbooks call it proof of something older, an unbroken line running back 25 centuries to a single Iron Age people who supposedly never left, never mixed, never lost the thread. One nation, one bloodline, one continuous story from the mountains to the present day. Then a genetics paper landed on that story and didn't destroy it. It just made it a lot more complicated. The paternal lineages, the Y chromosome data passed from father to son across generations, don't show a population that stayed walled off from everyone around it. They show almost the reverse. Deep, repeated contact with the very groups the national story says never got in. So here's the question nobody's put on a plaque yet. If the Illyrians never really disappeared, why does their supposed bloodline look almost identical to the people who conquered them? The accepted version starts clean enough. Greek and Roman writers were already naming Illyrian tribal confederations by the 4th century BC. The Ardii, the Dardani, the Taulantii, distinct groups with distinct territories along the western Balkan coast and its mountainous interior. Rome finished the job in 168 BC, crushing the Ardean kingdom and its queen Teuda, and folding the region into the empire's provincial system. That much isn't contested. What comes next is where the textbook version starts doing some quiet smoothing over. Because historians rarely put this part in the display case, nobody has ever actually agreed on which specific Illyrian tribe modern Albanians are supposed to descend from. Not the Ardii specifically, not the Dardani specifically. The connection is asserted at the level of Illyrian as a broad umbrella, which is a much softer claim than unbroken bloodline usually implies. The standard explanation for how that thread supposedly survived is the refuge theory. Albanian-speaking populations retreated into the highland interior, and while Slavic migrations reshaped the lowlands and the coast between the 6th and 7th centuries AD, the mountains kept both the language and the ancestry sealed off from that disruption. It's a tidy mechanism. It's also the load-bearing wall under most modern Albanian national identity. The textbook framing, the museum framing, the version taught from childhood. You'd expect a story that old and that foundational to be backed by decades of solid genetic confirmation. You'd be wrong. One number, sitting quietly inside a genetics paper from the year 2000 comparing Albanian and Greek populations, never actually lined up with the refuge story. And for years, almost nobody outside a narrow field of specialists noticed it was there. Here is where it gets complicated. That paper belongs to Michele Belletti's team at the University of Rome, La Sapienza, and it did something genuinely useful. It sampled Albanian populations directly and compared 2 separate genetic records against Aegean Greek island populations. One record is mitochondrial DNA, passed down the maternal line, mother to child, largely unchanged for thousands of years. A kind of genetic archive carried quietly through the women in every family tree. The other is the Y chromosome, passed father to son, and far more easily reshaped by history, because it only takes one migrating army, one wave of settlers, one generation of intermarriage to rewrite it. Belletti's maternal data looked exactly like what the refuge theory would predict. Long-term regional continuity, a population rooted in place for a very long time. The paternal data told a messier story, shaped, repeatedly, by men moving into the region from outside it. This is the first crack in the refuge theory, and it matters more than it sounds like at first pass, because it means the unbroken bloodline so often invoked in Albanian national identity is really only unbroken on one side of the family tree, and heavily overwritten on the other. Not by accident, not by a single event, by centuries. Later research pushed the resolution higher. Pericic and colleagues, publishing in Molecular Biology and Evolution out of the University of Split in 2005, sequenced Y chromosome haplotypes across the wider Balkans at a level of detail Belletti's original team didn't have access to, Albanian samples included. So which lineage actually gets to define Illyrian ancestry, if the maternal and paternal records inside the same population flatly disagree with each other? The clearest answer came a few years later, and it's the one detail from this entire body of research that should unsettle anyone treating the refuge theory as settled fact. Battaglia and collaborators, working across the University of Pavia and Rome, published in 2009 tracing the spread of a specific Y chromosome marker, haplogroup EV13, across the whole southeastern European landscape. What they found wasn't a marker unique to Albania. It showed up at very high frequency across Kosovo, across Macedonia, across Serbia, across Bosnia, even in parts of Greece. One marker, 6 countries, same story, everywhere. And the twist embedded in that finding is easy to miss on a first pass. EV13's actual spread pattern correlates far more strongly with the expansion of Neolithic farming populations, movements that happened thousands of years before any group calling itself Illyrian ever existed, than with anything specific to one Iron Age tribal confederation. The marker so often cited as evidence of a distinctly Albanian genetic inheritance may be both older and more widely shared across the region than the national story ever accounts for. That's the marker mainstream continuity researchers still lean on. Battalia's 2009 dataset is the real backbone of what's usually called the Illyrian genetic continuity argument. And the logic runs like this. EV13 shows up in Albanian populations at frequencies commonly cited above 25 to 30% across various regional samples. And researchers who favor the continuity reading argue that frequency, layered on top of Albanians' linguistic isolation, supports at least partial demographic continuity, running from Iron Age Balkan populations straight through to the present day. Proponents are careful, generally, to frame this as a probability rather than a certainty. The genetic signal is consistent with continuity, not proof of it. The limit shows up almost immediately once you widen the lens even slightly. EV13 isn't Illyrian specific. It appears at comparably high frequencies in Kosovo and in parts of North Macedonia, regions with entirely different, often bitterly contested medieval and modern histories of their own, which means the marker can't actually distinguish descendant of the Illyrians from descendant of any Balkan population shaped by the same Neolithic and Bronze Age migration waves that shaped half the peninsula. A marker supposedly built to prove one specific national lineage turns out to be one of the least specific markers in the entire region. So if your defining genetic evidence is shared by 3 or 4 modern nations, each one telling a different, mutually exclusive origin story about the exact same marker, whose version is actually correct? The continuity theory isn't wrong exactly. It holds up as far as it goes. It's just not enough on its own. Because underneath the EV13 story sits a second, far more complicated explanation for what's actually sitting in Albanian DNA. One that doesn't just complicate the continuity argument. It undercuts it. That second explanation has a name, and it has a number attached to it that Battalia's team couldn't fully account for. Large-scale gene flow from Slavic-speaking populations moving through the Balkans between the 6th and 9th centuries AD. Not a replacement of who was already there, but a layer poured directly on top of it. The broader Y chromosome dataset compiled by Pericic's team in 2005 put specific haplogroups behind this, I2A, R1A, and models them contributing a substantial minority share of paternal ancestry across the Balkans generally, Albania included, though at proportions lower than in nations to the north where Slavic became the dominant language. Here's where the continuity story gets complicated rather than destroyed. Albania never underwent the language shift its neighbors did. No Slavic tongue ever replaced Albanian the way it replaced whatever was spoken across much of Serbia, Bulgaria, or North Macedonia. And yet the paternal DNA shows measurable Slavic-era gene flow moving through the same population regardless. Language and ancestry, in other words, came apart from each other. They stopped moving as a single unit somewhere around the 7th century, and nobody fully agrees on why. You'd expect language and genes to travel together. They don't, here. How do you keep a language intact while your neighbors lost theirs, but still absorb some of the exact same migrating population they did? That's the part the refuge theory was actually built to answer, and it still might. Historians and geneticists mostly point to the same mountainous interior credited with saving the language, arguing it's a better explanation for differential linguistic resistance than for differential genetic isolation. The terrain kept the words in, it never fully kept the people out, which leaves a gap this explanation can't close on its own. Slavic-era admixture accounts for a portion of what shows up in the Y chromosome record. It doesn't explain why the language survived a wave that swallowed the languages of every population around it. 2 separate processes, running side by side, only one of them stopping at Albania's borders. There's a reason most researchers are more careful, more hedged when the conversation moves past this point, and it's worth naming why before going further. Because the next layer of evidence doesn't just complicate the national story. It removes the ground it's standing on entirely. That evidence comes from one of the largest ancient DNA projects ever run on this part of the world. Lazaridis and colleagues, working out of the Reich lab at Harvard with collaborators spanning the Balkans and Anatolia, published in Science in 2022 under the title, The Genetic History of the Southern Arc. Using genome sequencing pulled directly from ancient skeletal remains, not modern populations reconstructed backward, but actual Bronze and Iron Age individuals, the team found something that undercuts every side of this argument at once. Balkan populations from the Bronze and Iron Ages were already a complex, layered mixture. Anatolian farmer ancestry, Yamnaya-related steppe ancestry, older hunter-gatherer lineages, all present together, centuries before any group calling itself Illyrian existed as a named people. The original population was never simple to begin with. This is the theory researchers say quietly, in conference rooms and footnotes, more than they say it in public-facing summaries. Because it doesn't just complicate the Albanian national narrative. It undercuts the Greek one, the Serbian one, the Bulgarian one, every nationalist genetic continuity claim built on the premise that somewhere back at the root, there's one clean, undiluted ancestral population waiting to be reclaimed. There may not be one. The substrate itself was already a blend, assembled from at least 3 distinct ancestral sources, long before the Iron Age tribal confederations that everyone treats as the starting point. So if the ancient population was already mixed before the Illyrians existed as a named people at all, what exactly is the unbroken bloodline actually a claim about? Not a single origin, not a single moment. Something closer to a knot that was already tied before anyone started counting the threads. Picture the Mat River Valley in Albania's rugged north roughly 1,800 years ago. Limestone gorges cut the land into narrow corridors. Shepherds move flocks along transhumance routes worn smooth by centuries of the same seasonal migration, up to summer pasture and back down before the first snow. And in the middle of that landscape sits a garrison town, a mixed settlement where Latin moves through the market alongside an early form of the Albanian tongue, alongside the dialects carried in by soldiers posted from across the Roman Danube frontier. 3 or 4 languages, sometimes more, audible in the same square on the same afternoon. The Via Egnatia, the Roman road corridor threading through this exact region, connects that garrison town to the rest of the empire, to Italy in one direction, to Constantinople in the other. Isolation, even at the height of what the refuge theory imagines as total separation, was never absolute. The roads ran straight through it. A shepherd family living near that valley has sons. Within 2 generations, at least one of those sons will marry into the garrison town's mixed population. Not because of an invasion, not because of a single dramatic historical event, but because that's simply what happens when a trade route, a garrison, and a highland economy sit next to each other for a few hundred years. This is the actual mechanism behind everything the DNA record shows, not one migration, not one conquest. Thousands of small, ordinary household decisions, repeated for 2,000 years, each one leaving one more trace in the paternal or maternal line, which is the real reframe sitting underneath all 3 explanations. Continuity, Slavic admixture, deep Bronze Age blending. None of these are competing answers to one question. Together, they describe something else. How national identity and genetic ancestry quietly became 2 separate stories that only partly overlap. The same underlying datasets, Belletti's 2000 paper, Pericic's 2005 sequencing, Battaglia's 2009 marker study, Lazaridis's 2022 ancient genomes, get cited by Albanian nationalist commentators building a continuity case, and by scholars arguing directly against ethnic continuity claims. Same numbers, opposite conclusions, drawn from the identical table of figures. Here's the part that actually matters, and it isn't what it first sounds like. The twist isn't that Albanians are somehow not really descended from the Illyrians. In the loose sense of regional population continuity, the genetic evidence says they likely are, at least in part. That piece holds up. The twist is that, using the same markers and similar frequencies, so is almost every one of the 6 or 7 modern nations surrounding them. So what does a national bloodline even mean, genetically, in a region where one Bronze Age population fed into a dozen separate modern identities, each one insisting it's the exception to a rule that apparently applies to everyone equally? That's the uncomfortable center of this entire story, and it's worth sitting in for a moment rather than rushing past. Genetic ancestry data was never built to answer questions about modern national identity. It answers questions about population movement, who mixed with whom, when, and by roughly how much. The 2 get conflated constantly. In Albania, in Serbia, in Greece, in Hungary, in every country currently running a national genetic heritage campaign off a dataset that was designed to trace migration, not to certify belonging. Widen the lens far enough and Albania stops looking like an exception at all. Every nation that has ever staked its identity on an unbroken bloodline, Greek, Serbian, Bulgarian, Hungarian, Basque, runs into the identical wall the moment the ancient DNA comes back from the lab. The deeper the sequencing goes, the less any population on Earth resembles a closed system. The Southern Arc Project's broader finding wasn't really about Albania specifically at all. It found that the entire Eastern Mediterranean and Balkan corridor functioned as one continuous mixing zone for at least 4,000 years, long before any of the modern names, Albanian, Greek, Serbian, Illyrian, existed for anyone to claim. Think of it less like a bloodline and more like a river delta, 100 small channels braiding and rebraiding across the same flat plain, each one carrying part of the same water, none of them running in a single straight line to the sea. Ask which channel is the real one, and the question stops making sense somewhere upstream. Albanian DNA didn't erase Albania's history. It broke the idea that history was ever a single, unbroken line to begin with, and left in its place something closer to that delta, older, wider, and far harder to draw a clean border around than anyone standing in a museum, reading a plaque about 25 centuries of unbroken descent, was ever told.